Hi, and welcome to the second half of this talk on getting started with Duende Identity Server. In the first part of this talk, we saw how to set up Identity Server and how to get a token using curl. In this part of the talk, we'll see how to protect an API with Identity Server, and we'll see how to protect an MVC application and use the tokens from Identity Server to allow access both to the MVC application and to the API. So the first thing we'll do is to create a service with an API. So to create this service and to add this API, we're going to create a web API application. So from the shell, I can run .NET new, and then the template is now called web API. If we look in this directory, we'll see it creates for me a project called weather API, and that will return some weather data. So what I've done now is I've created a solution using JetBrains Rider, and I just loaded that project that I created from the shell into that solution. So the first thing I'd like to do here is change the ports. These are currently listening on port 7032 for HTTPS and 5173 for HTTP. I'm going to change these to 5445 and 5002. And then if I run this, just to see it working, and if we browse to the site, then sure enough, we get the weather data. This is just randomized data that's just created by this service. So the next step will be to add security to this service and then only make the service available if we have a bearer token to use. So now that we have this, we need to protect it. So back in the project, the first thing I want to do is to add the authorized attribute to the controller. And if I restart this, then go back to the browser, we now get an exception. And the exception we're getting here is saying we've added the authorized attribute, but we haven't added authentication yet. So that's what I want to do next. So we're going to authenticate this using something called bearer authentication. If you remember, we just grabbed a token from Identity Server. That's known as a bearer token. Our client will send that token to this server, and this server will then check that that token is valid. And to do that, we don't need any libraries from Identity Server, but we do need to connect to Identity Server to send it a copy of the token. And to do that, we're going to use a Microsoft NuGet package. So if I go into NuGet, the package we want is called microsoft.aspnetcore.authentication.jwtbearer. So I select that and add it into my project. We then need to configure that code in our program.cs file. So inside here, we need to add a new service. So we do builder.services, and we're going to add our authentication service. When we add the authentication service, we need to tell the service what scheme it is for. And the scheme in our case is going to be bearer. We could just put the string here, bearer, or there's a constant defined in that package that we can use called, in a namespace called JWT bearer defaults, and the value is authentication scheme. And we also need to configure this service. We also, for example, need to tell it how to connect to our Identity Server. So we do that by calling add.bearer. This takes an options, and inside this options, we set a couple of values. We're going to set the authority, and this is the URL of our Identity Server. So this is going to be HTTPS localhost 5443, and that's the endpoint of our Identity Server. We also tell this the name of the audience that we're checking this token for. And that's going to be our weather API. That's the name of the audience. And we also finally have to tell it what the token type is. And we do that by adding a token validation parameters, valid types. This is an array of valid types, and we specify the name of the type. And the name for our JOT token is AT plus JWT. Once we have that, then in this code, we also need to add a call to app.useAuthentication to make sure we add this authentication into the pipeline. Okay, given that, let's restart the service. And now, if I browse to the service, we get back a 401. So we now have authentication in place, but we are no longer authenticated, or we are not authenticated. So we're not able to hit this endpoint. So to hit this endpoint, we need to get a bearer token, and we already know how to do that. So we saw earlier, I can send an HTTP post to my Identity Server, to this connect token endpoint, I can specify the client ID, the scope, and the secret, and this will give me back a token. I can then use that token, which I'm going to grab here, in another HTTP request. And that request looks like this. So this time I'm sending a GET to the weather forecast endpoint, and I specify an authorization header. The type of authorization is bearer, and into that header we pass the token. So if I grab this command and go to my shell and paste that command in, we hit the endpoint and we are getting back the weather data. So we've hit the endpoint, we've been authorized, and it's returning the data to us. If in the shell I run that command without the bearer token, it fails. We get back no data. We're getting back a 401 here. Curl is just not printing out the return value we get back here. But we are getting back a 401, the same as if we would hit this endpoint from the browser without the bearer token. So we've now seen how to add an API, how to protect that API using IdentityServer, how to call that API using a token. So what I'd like to do now is to write a .NET client for this API. And I'm going to do that by writing an MVC application. So if I go back into Rider this time, I'm going to add the application from inside Rider itself rather than doing this from the command line. So here I'm going to do add new project. We're going to add an ASP.NET Core web application. The name of this is going to be Weather MVC. It's a model view controller application, C#, .NET 6, and no authentication. I'll create this. Again, if I go into launch settings here, I'm going to change the ports. This time we're going to run on 5444 and 5101. Again, the HTTP port doesn't matter. We're only using HTTPS, but just for completeness sake, I'm changing that port as well. Okay, so before we write code in here, let me go back into the Weather API application for a moment, go back into my controller and remove this authorize attribute. And the reason I'm doing that is that we're going to add a client to our MVC application. That client's going to call into this Weather API service, and we want to make sure that client's working before we add any authentication to it. Okay, so in here, we have a single controller called the home controller. And on this controller, I'm going to add another endpoint. We'll make this an async endpoint. It'll return a task of iActionResult, and we'll call this weather. So from here, I'm going to call the API endpoint. So to do that, I need an HTTP client. So I can say something like using var client equals new HTTP client. On the client, I'm going to call the get method to send a get request to the endpoint, and that's going to return me a result. So let's say var result. This will be an async method, so I want to await on it. And I want to await on client.getAsync. And to get async, we pass the URL, in this case, of our weather service. And that's HTTPS localhost 5445/weather forecast. When I get that result back, I can check to make sure it's valid. So do we have a success status code? If we do, we'll do some processing. If we don't, we'll throw an exception. So let's do throw new exception, and in here say unable to get content. Okay, so the content we get back here is going to be JSON. I want to decode that JSON into a C# object. So to do that, I'm going to add a new C# class to my project. So in my models directory, I'm going to create a model called weather data. This has the date, the temperature in Celsius, the temperature in Fahrenheit, and the summary string that comes back from the service. Back in the code, I want to decode the incoming JSON into that model. And to do that, I'm going to use Newtonsoft JSON. So in NuGet, I can add the Newtonsoft.json NuGet package to my weather MVC project. And then in here, I can say something like var model equals await result.content.readAsString async. So that gives me back text, and I can then decode that text into data. So I can say var data equals JSON convert dot deserialize object from the model. I'm going to deserialize it into a list of weather data. Then once I have that, I'm going to return a view that contains that data. Then I can add a view to display this data. And that view will look like this. So we reference the model as a list of weather data. And then inside the view, we iterate over that list and just show in a table the date, the summary, and the temperatures. So if I run the weather MVC application and browse to localhost 5444 home weather, then sure enough, we get back the weather data. But remember, I did turn off authorization on the API. So if I go back to my code and go back to the weather API and the weather forecast controller and turn authorization back on, and then restart the weather API application and go back to the browser and refresh, then sure enough, we're throwing an exception. So we're now trying to hit an endpoint that requires authorization. We aren't authorized because we're not sending across a bearer token. So we don't get a success code coming back. And it's the MVC application that's now throwing this exception. So let's go and fix that. So I need some way within this MVC application of connecting to the identity server and asking it for a token. And the way I'm going to do that is by introducing a service. So inside Weather MVC, I'm going to add a new directory called services. And then in here, I'm going to add a token service. So before I show you the service, I want to do one more thing. I want to add another NuGet package. And the package I want to add is called identity model. And we're going to add this into our MVC application. And this has some helpers, this has some properties and some methods that we'll use in our code. So in my services directory, I'm going to add 3 files. This is code that I wrote earlier, and this is the code that makes up the token service. So there's an iToken service interface that has a method called getToken, and this returns a token response. And that token response comes from the identity model package. And this just contains the details of the token. There's also an identity server settings file. And if I look in here, this identity server settings has things like the discovery URL. So where do we get the discovery document from, the name of the client, and also the client's password. And those values map onto the values we set for the client inside Identity Server. So inside Identity Server, remember we had 2 clients configured. We have the M2M client, and inside the M2M client, we have a client ID, and we have a password. And that password is this value here. It's the client secret that we're going to use. When we load this service, we need to load these settings. We need to load these values. And we're going to get these values from the app settings file. So in the app settings file, we have a section called Identity Server Settings. Inside here, it has the discovery URL, which is the endpoint for our identity server. It has the client name, which is m2m.client, and it has the client password, which is the client secret that we set in Identity Server. And we then have the implementation of the token service. So we have a class called token service that implements iToken service. This has an iOptions, which is this identity server settings that we load from the configuration. And we hold in here a reference to the discovery document. So in the constructor for the service, we call this getDiscoveryDocument async method. That comes from the identity model NuGet package that we installed. And we pass this the discovery URL. And this comes back with the discovery documents. We hold a reference to our discovery document inside here. And we need that discovery document as it's from there we can get the URL of the token endpoint. Inside the getToken method, we call another helper method called requestClientCredentialsToken async. And that gives us back a token response. And into this, we pass in the token endpoint, we pass in the client name, we pass in the client password, and we also specify the scopes that we want. And this gives us back a token. So this token response will contain this bearer token. So to use this, I need to do 2 things. In my home controller, I have to inject this. So inside here, I'm going to say token service, and then assign that to a variable. Remember, an instance of this will be constructed, and that constructor will go and get the discovery document. Then inside the call to the weather endpoint, I need to access the token from that service and add that token as a bearer token to my HTTP client GET call. So inside here, I want to say something like this: var token equals _ token service dot get token. Remember, the parameter to this is the scope. So that's weather API dot read in this case. That will give me back a token, assuming it succeeds, or will throw an exception if not. So this is an async call, so we need to await on it. So once I have that, I can then set this token on the client. So to do that, I can say client.setBearerToken. This is another helper function on identity model. And then to this, I can pass token.accessToken. And that will add the bearer token as a header, as an authentication header on this client before it sends the request. So once I have that, I now need to configure the application to make use of that service. So back in program.cs, I can do this. I can say builder.services.addSingleton. I'm going to add the iToken service and the token service. So that will fire the token service up. But remember, if I look at this token service, this needs some configuration. This is past an iOptions of identity server settings. So I have to configure that in program.cs as well. So to do that, so inside here we say builder.services.configure, and I need to specify the type here, the shape of the data I'm grabbing from the app settings, and that's my identity server settings. And then to this, I have to pass a reference to that section inside app settings. So we call builder.configuration.getSection, and we give it the name of the section. And the section name is identity server settings. As we just saw, that's this section here. So this line of code will load those values from the app settings configuration file, and it will pass those settings into the token service as this iOptions of type identity server settings. Okay, so with that in place, if I restart my weather MVC application and then hit the home weather endpoint again, then we now get back the data. So now we've been authorized, we're sending across the bearer token, and we can get the data from the weather API. So just to go over this one more time, what are we trying to do? We're trying to hit this protected endpoint, get, on this controller, on the weather forecast controller, with the authorized attribute. And to do that, we need a token. We're trying to make that call from this weather endpoint here. So it's at this point that we need that token. To get that token, we're injecting a service called the token service. For the token service, we have a set of initialization, and that initialization data is held in appsettings.json, and it's this identity server settings. We load that initialization data, that configuration data, here in program.cs by calling builder.services.configure and passing it the name of the section. When the token service itself is loaded, that configuration data is passed in. And the first thing we do is use that configuration data to get the discovery document by calling getDiscoveryDocumentAsync. Back in the controller, we call getToken to get the token. And that's a method call on the token service. And that getToken call calls request client credentials token async. We use the endpoint from the discovery document, and then things like the client name and the client password from the configuration to configure this request. If that succeeds, it returns the token. And we can then call client.setBearerToken to pass that token in the authorized header of the request. That token is then checked by the protected API, and assuming the token is okay at that point, the call succeeds. Okay, so we are most of the way there. We have an MVC client that gets a bearer token from identity server, sends that bearer token to the API, and that API checks that bearer token with identity server to make sure it's valid. I want to do one more thing. I want to add authentication onto the MVC client. So So what a mechanism whereby when we try and hit this endpoint on the MVC client, this endpoint is also marked as requiring authentication. We throw up a user interface. The user has to enter a username and password. And if that succeeds, they get access to the MVC client. And then the MVC client can go on and get access to the API client. So let's do that now. Okay, so the API endpoint is protected, but this endpoint here, this weather endpoint itself, is not protected. So at the moment, we don't require a user to authenticate before they can hit this weather endpoint. So here I can just refresh the page. There's no authorization. There's no authentication required to allow the user to get this weather data. So what I'd like to do is to make sure that the user has to authenticate before they can ask for the weather data. So when we do this, the first step is to add the authorize attribute to this endpoint. Now, if I restart this MVC application and refresh the page, we now get an exception. And again, we saw something similar to this previously. It's saying there's no authentication scheme specified. So basically, I've said I want to be authorized, but I haven't said how I want to be authorized. So to add authorization to this, we'd like the user to log in. So the first question is where do we add the UI for that login? Well, we're going to use IdentityServer. So we're going to ask the user to log in via IdentityServer. So we're going to add that user interface onto IdentityServer itself. And to do this, we're going to cheat slightly. So we saw earlier, we can build IdentityServer from a template. And that template will give us a user interface. But we can add that user interface retrospectively to this application here. So if I go to this URI, so github.com, Duende software, identityserver.quickstart.ui, this is a Git repository that contains the Quickstart user interface code. And if I scroll down here, it gives us a couple of ways of allowing us to add this code into our project. If you're running on Windows, you can run a PowerShell script. So that's the IEX script there. If you're running on Mac OS or Linux, and I'm running on Mac here, you can use this curl script. So if I grab this curl script and copy it to the clipboard, so I'm in the IdentityServer project directory here in my shell. So inside here, we have the CS proj file, we have the program.cs. From here, if I paste in that curl script and run the script, look in this directory, so we can see now there's a pages folder, there's a www root folder. So we updated our project with this user interface code. So back in JetBrains Rider, this is the IdentityServer project. We can see now we have our pages folder with some Razor pages in here for the code. And we have a www root folder with, again, things like the CSS, the JavaScript that we need to create a user interface on top of IdentityServer. So to do that, there are some changes I have to make. So in IdentityServer, I need to make some changes to program.cs. So in here, currently, we're only mapping a GET request to the root endpoint and returning hello world. We need to change this now so that we map onto the controllers and we return the appropriate UI, we return the appropriate response. There's a few things I need to add here. So let me get rid of this map get. So I need to say app.use static files, app.use routing, app.use authorization. We need to add our Razor pages. So we need to say app.map Razor pages, and then we need to call require authorization as well. So down here, we've said map Razor pages, but I have to add the Razor pages service. Here we call builder.services.add Razor pages, and we should be good to go. So here now, if I refresh IdentityServer and rerun the app, and then browse to the localhost 5443 endpoint, which is the IdentityServer homepage. Previously, when we hit this endpoint, it served up the text hello world. Now, if I hit this endpoint, we now get the Duende IdentityServer welcome page. So we've definitely added some UI onto IdentityServer. So now that I have that, I can go back into my weather service and add the code required to ask IdentityServer to authenticate the user. So again, I'll need some configuration for this. So in app-settings.json, I'm going to add another configuration section. And this section is called interactive service settings. So the authority URL is localhost 5443. That's IdentityServer. And then the client ID and the client secret are the values we set on the client inside IdentityServer. So I look inside IdentityServer and look at my config code and scroll down to look at the client. This is my interactive client, and this is my client secret. Notice it ends in 86B0, and this is the client secret here. Notice as well that this client here, the interactive client, has some URIs set up. So there's a redirect URI, which is localhost 5444, something called a front channel logout URI, a post logout redirect URI, and these all point at localhost 5444. If I look back in my MVC application and look at the launch settings, indeed, we are listening on port 5444. So Identity Server knows about this application. We now need to configure this application so that it knows about Identity Server. So to communicate with Identity Server to ask for user authentication, we are going to use OpenID Connect. And to do that, we need to add a NuGet package. So in here, I need to add the Microsoft.ASP.NET Core.Authentication.OpenID Connect package. And I'm adding that to my MVC application. Now in Program CS for this application, I have to configure the authentication. So in here, I'm going to call builder.services.add.authentication. And again, this takes an options. So for this options, we need to tell it what scheme to use. And these schemes have a name, and we'll just call our scheme cookie. We need to tell it how we're going to challenge. So we have something called the default challenge scheme. And for that, as we've said, we're going to use OIDC. And at this point, the authentication is configured, but we need to add some extra stuff to our services. So we call add cookie. The cookie has a name, and that's the name you specified above to use. That's going to be cookie. I need to configure OIDC Connect. So I call add OpenID Connect. We tell it the name we've used for the challenge scheme here. So these two match up. That's OIDC. And again, we pass some options to configure this. In here, we have to tell it the URL of the authority to use. That's the URL of our identity server. And that's one of the things we put into our configuration, into appsettings.json. So to get at that, we say builder.configuration, and we give it the name of that value in the appsettings.config file, which is interactive service settings : authority URI. We do the same thing for the client ID. So options.client ID, and that again is builder.configuration, but this time it's interactive service settings : client ID. And also the client secret. Okay, we also need to add the scopes. So we have an options.scope, which is a collection. We're going to add something into this collection. And again, the value we're going to add comes from the configuration file. And it's interactive service settings, scopes. And as this is an array, the index into the array is element 0. Okay, with that in place, there are a few more options we need to add here. And these options are going to tell us how to interact with Identity Server. So we set something called a response type. So we're going to use code. And this matches the grant type set in Identity Server. We set use PKCE to be true. We set the response mode to be query. And then we say that I want to save these tokens so they're available for use later on. So what are these things? So save tokens tells the server to save the tokens it gets back into the cookie. Response mode sets this up so that the data carried back in the response comes back in the query string. And then use PKCE, pronounced Pixie. And what PKCE stands for is Proof Key for Code Exchange. And this is basically a mechanism for protecting the communication in the background while we're exchanging our information to get these tokens. Okay, so now that we have client authentication here, i.e. the client's logging into the application, the client will be allowed to access certain scopes. And as part of this authentication, it will get back an access token. Now, currently, when our MVC controller turns around and calls the API, it gets a token from the token service. It says, I'm the client, give me back a token, and then we use that token to hit the API. But now, as I've just said, we're actually getting back a token as part of our user authentication here. And we can use that token. So in here, rather than calling getToken from the token service, if I get rid of that line, I can get the token given to the client from the HTTP context. And this is another extension method here. So we call getTokenAsync on the HTTP context. That gives me back a token that's a string. I can then just call setBearerToken with that token and then turn around and call the API. And then finally down here, as well as app.useAuthorization, I want to say app.useAuthentication. Okay, with all that in place, we should be good to go. So if I take my weather MVC application and restart it, from here, if I go to /home/weather, it now asks me to authenticate. And if you remember, in IdentityServer, we set up a user called Alice with a password called Alice. So I click on login. At this point, it's asking me to consent to this login. Now, this is not the default behavior. I'll show you how to get the default behavior in a moment. To get this behavior, if I look back inside IdentityServer, I've turned on the require consent equals true value for this client. That defaults to false, so if I left that out, it wouldn't require consent. I'll show you that in a moment. So back here, it's telling me what's being asked for. So my user ID, my user profile, things like my names, access to weather API.read, and then I can allow or don't allow. So if I say yes, allow, it takes me to home weather. That now has the token. I've been authenticated. I've been authorized to use this endpoint. That itself then gets a token to call across to the API service. That token is also checked and we get back the data. So let me go back to IdentityServer here, remove this field, restart IdentityServer. So again, from the home page here, if I go to home weather, it has to authenticate me. If I type in Alice and log in, then it's no longer asking me for consent. You can enable or disable that. But now we have a complete end-to-end solution. We have our MVC application, which is the front end for the user. That asks the user to authenticate. That front end talks to the back end. That's a protected API. And to talk to the back end, that has to get a token from IdentityServer and send that token across. So we're using OIDC to authenticate the user, and then we're using a Java Web Token to authenticate against the back end. As I mentioned earlier, we'll put this code up on GitHub, and the repository is here. So that's the end of this walkthrough. I hope you've enjoyed it.